Joshua Tiemans of the Tiemans Collectives says, who's your pick for a wartime president, alive or dead, real or fictional, and why? Well, if it's real or fictional, I'll go with James T. Kirk of the Starship Enterprise. Here's a guy who knows what he likes. He's not a mean guy. He's not a sadistic guy. He's just confident and he knows what he wants. I think probably real is probably a better question. It's hard to say, really. It's easier to pick a wartime general, because if you have a wartime general, I want guys like Patton, and I want guys like, I hate it when Curtis LeMay. And I think that the essential quality of a wartime president is a guy who's got the nerve and the courage to fight and win, and at the same time has to have certain mitigating qualities that I wouldn't want in a general. He has to have a certain amount of mercy and a certain amount of I almost said decency, but it's not really. Restraint maybe is a somewhat better word. In other words, I think the perfect wartime president is a guy who's keeping a firm hand on the leash of wartime generals, and those generals don't have any of that mitigating qualities. I want those wartime generals out there, kicking ass. The two great stories about this, kind of what I think a wartime general should be, is, Patton was moving Third Army through the south of France after he broke out of Normandy. He's moving faster than his supplies, and I forget what the town was, and somebody's going to point it out to me because they'll know exactly what I'm talking about, but I'm just sketching it out because I just remember it vaguely from memory. But Patton's moving Third Army through the south of Germany, and he says there's a city, let's say, it's Boulogne. It wasn't Boulogne, but let's just say it was. And he says, I'm gonna detach a regiment. I'm gonna take Boulogne. And Ike, back at headquarters, says, George, you can't take that town with a regiment. You're forbidden to do it. I forbid you to do it. You hold your position and or just keep going. And then 2 hours later, he radios back and he says, have taken Boulogne with one regiment. Do you want me to give it back? That's what you want for a wartime general. Curtis LeMay said something that I just loved. I mean, LeMay was you make a pretty good case he was a warmonger. Well, of course he's a warmonger. A monger is somebody who sells something, and LeMay sells war. It's what he was good at. And I don't see anything particularly wrong with that. But LeMay said, he had this is one of my favorite quotes ever. He had the Strategic Air Command. He had all these nuclear bombers and nuclear missiles under his command. And as I've said this on the show several times, one of my favorite quotes ever, the motto of the Strategic Air Command was a mailed fist. It was an armored fist, a knight's fist, and there were lightning bolts in the fist. It's the greatest logo ever. But the motto of the Strategic Air Command was, peace is our profession. And I thought that was a great motto for the Strategic Air Command. Wonderful motto for the Strategic Air Command. Peace is our profession. Because they understood the deterrent power of these nuclear weapons, and that's why we never got into a big war after there were nuclear weapons. In any event, Curtis LeMay, who's commander of SAC, who invented SAC, basically was asked about this once, and he said to the press, he said, yeah, peace is our profession. War is just something we do for kicks. And that's exactly what I want in my generals. I want the enemies of this country to think that it's only through my restraint that these mad dogs are not unleashed. Was it mad dogs, not unleashed? But that's the difference between a wartime president and a wartime general. The wartime general shouldn't be unleashed. He shouldn't have any desire to be unleashed. The wartime general should be like Patton or LeMay, should be just attack dogs. But the correct president should be the kind of guy who is willing to let them go to work, but also understands that there is more to a war than the military. There's the political aspect of it. There's the quality of mercy, and there's the post-war reality, and there's a lot of variables that a general shouldn't be weighing. That's the president's job. Now, when you get into wartime presidents, you got a couple of good choices here. I think I know a lot of people have a problem with Abe Lincoln, and a lot of people think that the federalism of the North and make the case for states' rights. But I have to tell you, Sherman, who was, without question, William Tecumseh Sherman was the first modern Western wartime general. Sherman was the first general to understand that this is not just a war of armies on battlefields, that this is a war of civilizations, of cultures. Sherman basically said from day one, we're going to have to burn the South to the ground, and we're going to have to burn the fight out of them in order for this thing to be over. He understood that real early. He was called insane in the beginning of the war. They relieved him of his command because he said it's going to be a long war, and it's going to be a tough war, and it's not going to end until the South is on fire, because they're not going to stop fighting until that happens. So Sherman, who is not a pushover by any means, Sherman is one of the most rabid, aggressive, determined, tough generals that the world has ever produced, let alone this country. But Sherman, who met Lincoln only once on board that ship in Anchor, just right after the fall of Richmond, I mean, hours afterwards. Sherman said of Lincoln, he said he'd never seen anybody who could combine so many qualities of greatness and goodness into one man. It's the goodness that matters. Lincoln, Lincoln lived long enough to go and sit in Jefferson Davis's chair. Lincoln had the courage to walk through Richmond 7 hours after Lee's army evacuated the town, with rebel sharpshooters potentially behind every single building. Lincoln rode on a horse through Richmond with a detachment of 12 cavalrymen. That's it. The President of the United States, who didn't win a single popular vote in the deep Confederacy, the 7 states of the Confederacy, the original 7 states, Abraham Lincoln did not win a single vote. Forget electoral vote. He didn't win a single vote, not even as a gag, in any one of those 7 states. He was the most despised man ever in the South. Had the courage to ride with an escort of 12 troopers through Richmond a few hours after Lee's army has left, walks across Jefferson Davis's famous intimidating white rug, because everybody had boots on and mud and everything, sat in his chair and was president of the whole United States for a while. And Lincoln, even then, while the war was still being fought, was basically saying, let these people up easy. We can't, they're our countrymen. We disagreed, and now the war's over, and we need to treat them as our countrymen. We need to pardon them all. We need to pardon the political leadership, and then the upper-level political leadership. Grant asked him, what should we do with them? And he just kind of went shoo them away, like he'd be happy if they just left the country. So Lincoln was, he's an amazing balance. And Lincoln, the reason I keep coming back to Lincoln, he had that kindness, and the guards outside the White House for years would walk down the aisles, just the aisles in the bedrooms of the White House. And even these hardened guards would sometimes they'd just be moved to tears because they could hear Lincoln moaning in his sleep, just moaning and thrashing and wailing and moaning for years. Lincoln practically died of exhaustion. There's a good side-by-side picture of him in 1860 and 1864. He looks like he's aged 30 years in those 4 years. And the fact that he was just tormented and moaning in his sleep, and that's what a wartime president needs. He needs that sense of decency. And Lincoln would say things like, I'm supposed to shoot a farm boy for deserting and not touch the hair of the agitator who's incited him to desert. I'd rather shoot the agitator and leave the farm boy to go back to the farm. It was a tremendous decency, and yet he had the strength, right? I mean, Shelby Foote was talking about Abraham Lincoln, and what Lincoln was looking for, as most of you know, the Army of the Potomac just got whipped again and again and changed commanders. What was it, 7 times? McClellan, McDermott, what's his name? McDowell. McDowell, McClellan, Burnside, Hooker. I'm missing one or two. What's his name? Second Manassas guy. Anyway, you get the idea, right? So general after general after general after general, defeat after defeat after defeat after defeat. And after Fredericksburg, which was one of the worst defeats ever, just appalling loss, just a catastrophe. That was Burnside, so there's another one. After Fredericksburg, Lincoln sat down and said, if we were to have a series of catastrophes like Fredericksburg, if we were to suffer a Fredericksburg every month or every week, in 6 months the war would be over and we would win, because we have the kind of resources that we can afford those kind of horrific defeats. As long as we just keep having them, as long as we just don't run away from them, we can be annihilated the way we were at Fredericksburg and still win the war. And Lincoln, according to Shelby Foote, Shelby Foote said what Lincoln was looking for was a term I never forgot. I read it, I never forgot. It went right to the heart of me. He said he was looking for the killer mathematician. Lincoln used the term he needed a general who could face the numbers. And basically what Lincoln is saying is, we're going to have to kill 1 million of our guys to win this war. And I need a general who's willing to go out and do it, because we're not going to get out of this lighter than this. There's no cheap way to pay this bill. He wanted a general who could face the arithmetic. That's the term he used. A general who could face the arithmetic, which meant that we just have to keep going at him and going after him. Pope, thank you, guys. So yeah, and so when you got a guy who's having nightmares about having to hang a farm boy for desertion, at the same time he's trying to find a general who can put 500,000 men in the ground to win this thing. That's as good as it gets, I would say, in terms of balance. Churchill had that quality of decency. Reagan had that quality of toughness and decency. Yeah. I think Roosevelt was actually a catastrophe for the country. It was one of the worst things that happened to this country domestically. But as a wartime president, I thought he was rather good. He tried to get us... He had a very fine line to walk in the beginning of the war. He was sending supplies and destroyers and jeeps and tanks not only to Britain but to Russia before we were at war. And if he hadn't been so arrogant with regards to Joseph Stalin, if he didn't think that he could charm Joseph Stalin, I don't know if he could have much improved on Franklin as a wartime president. But God knows he was a catastrophe in terms of everything else. All right, we got a couple here more, 4 more to go, and then we'll get on out of here. I might go get some dinner and see what's going on. Maybe have an evening.